Right. So let's say you want to get started in identifying and removing miasmatic blocks in your patients, and you are looking at targeted anti-miasmatic remedies to unlock these stuck challenging cases. Now, if you've learned miasms in school, it can seem like a big black hole. Like, how do you know that there is a block in the first place? And what type of miasm is actually blocked? There are so many types of miasms, so many types of miasmatic approaches, each clashing with the other. So how do you find these anti-miasmatic remedies, these no-zodes? And if you try and look into this, you have all these different types of contemporary miasms also thrown around. We have the traditional sora, psychosis, syphilis, tuberculosis, and then we have typhoid and malaria and ringworm and leprous and FARC and more, right? And then on top of these, you have these acronyms thrown around. The fundamental miasm, the inherited miasm, the dominant miasm, the latent miasm. And on top of that, you're anxious that you do not want to aggravate or harm your patients by giving these no-zodes and anti-miasmatics in the wrong dosing. So in the light of all that, this is the ultimate guide on how you can get started with miasms and their approaches. So this is the video I wish I would have had when I started my study on miasms in school 25 years ago. So we're going to cover this by thinking about incorporating the 3 key miasmatic tools within your practice blueprint and taking those baby steps. All right. So to start with, there are 3 strategies that will help you tremendously in your practice. The first one is the startup strategy. The second is the classical strategy, and the third is the breakthrough strategy. I've covered this in a lot detail in my video, The Homeopathic Practice Blueprint. So don't forget to check that. I will provide a link to that below this video. But let me give you a brief overview here so that you can, deep dive into the miasmatic approaches for each of these strategies, right? So the first one is the startup strategy. This is applicable for patients who present at stage 1 and 2. And what are those patients? Stage 1 and 2 patients are those who present with just a diagnosis. They give you only a local disease diagnosis with some common symptoms for the chief complaint. The next strategy is the classical strategy. It's applicable for patients who present at stage 2 and 3. And what does that mean? These are the patients where you can find some peculiar characteristic symptoms, either locally or generally, where you can understand this patient as a whole. Now, the next one is the breakthrough strategy. It's applicable for patients who present at stage 4, which means these are the patients who are very, very aware of their disturbed vitality at an energetic level. You can find unique, rare, strange sensations and source patterns clearly in these patients. So, what are the indicated remedies that you use for each strategy? When you're using the startup strategy, you need what I call the startup group of remedies. They are typically organ remedies or homeopathic specifics based on specific diagnostic or therapeutic indication. With the classical strategy, you will need classical group of remedies. What are those? Typically, they are keynote remedies or constitutional remedies given more on the general picture. And then with the breakthrough strategy, you will need the breakthrough group of remedies. And what are those? They're typically based on the deeper, peculiar sensation or the kingdom or the source understanding of the patient. Now, again, I have shared more details on these strategies and the remedies in my free video on Homeopathic Practice Blueprint, where I've dropped the link below this video. But here's the most critical thing in all these strategies. This is the mistake most practitioners make while prescribing, and that is they ignore the miasmatic remedies. So the most critical skill is understanding what anti-miasmatic remedies should you use for each strategy. This is the secret of success. If you don't get anything from this video, please understand this is critical. Your treatment will not work dramatically if you do not cover the miasm for each of these strategies. If your indicated startup or classical or breakthrough remedies do not cover the miasm, then you have to use a separate anti-miasmatic remedy. If you do not use these miasmatic remedies, the indicated remedies, no matter how accurate they are, they will not work. The cases will stagnate, they will go around in circles, or they might work to a particular point and they might stop working. This is the only way we ensure you can break those miasmatic obstacles and unfold the case in the right direction without suppression in the fastest way possible. So if you do this right, you can shift the case to a completely new level, regardless of what strategy and what approach you are using. So what approach do you use to find the anti-miasmatic remedies? Now, we have three types of miasmatic approaches in homeopathy. The first one is the Hahnemannian Miasmatic approach. The second one is the Kentian Miasmatic approach. And the third one is your Sankaran's Miasmatic approach. So what are these miasmatic approaches all about? Let's look at the Hahnemannian Miasmatic approach. So this is used in startup strategies, okay? Now here you look at the past history and you check if there is a specific causative factor or a not been well since syndrome, since that causative factor that holds that startup layer. So what are these causative factors? They could be infection, they could be suppressions due to certain conventional drugs, vaccines, toxins such as heavy metal poisoning, some chemicals, trauma. It could be a physical or a mental trauma, grief, shock, disappointment. So anything and everything that can create an imprint and create a not been well since syndrome since that causative factor. So to start with, Hahnemann identified three key infections that could create a miasmatic block. One is through a scabies mite, the second is through gonorrheal infection, and the third is through syphilitic infection. Now these would cause the three fundamental miasms Hahnemann spoke about: sora, psychosis, and syphilis. But after that, there have been a lot of contemporary miasms from other causes that could create a block, such as vaccine damage, a vaccine block, or a radiation block from radiation therapy, or a steroid or some other chemotherapeutic block from intense suppressive treatments. You could have a streptococcal block from streptococcal infections, an Epstein-Barr viral block, if somebody's not been well since glandular fever, and so on. So lots of different agents have been now known and seen to create these sort of acquired miasmatic blocks in addition to these three fundamental miasmatic blocks. So next, let's look at the Kentian miasmatic approach. Now, the Kentian miasmatic approach is used in classical strategies. Now, in this case, unlike the Hahnemannian miasmatic approach, you're not looking at infectious agents, but you're looking at patterns or tendencies or susceptibilities that run across the different layers. So if you look at some other associated illnesses that run through in the past history, or you look at the family history, you can see that all these illnesses, apart from the chief complaint in the past, have certain common patterns or certain common tendencies that recur across time. So to start with, Kentian homeopaths identified three classical patterns or three classical tendencies that could create a miasmatic block. One is tendency to irritation or inflammation or have some sort of nutritional deficiencies. This is Kentian sora. Second could be a tendency to growths, stasis, stagnation, fixity. This is what they call Kentian psychosis. And the third could be a tendency to some destructive effects, necrosis, degeneration, mentally, physically, such as, suicidal, homicidal tendencies. This is Kentian syphilis, right? So now let's move on to the Sankaran's miasmatic approach. So this is the approach that is used in breakthrough strategies. Now here we are looking at not the past infections, not the past tendencies, but we are looking at reaction to the illnesses or reaction to the coping mechanism they are using to deal with the illnesses. This is what it's a Sankaran's miasmatic block. So let me give you examples. Say if they're struggling with the illness, but they're quite hopeful of that recovery, it's Sankaran sora. If they're in denial or they are avoiding it or suppressing it, this is Sankaran psychosis. If they're overwhelmed by it, they're drowning in it, they're suffocating in it, it's Sankaran tubercular. If they are overwhelmed, but they are getting more desperate and losing control, this is Sankaran's cancer. And if they are completely hopeless and giving up and desperate, that is Sankaran syphilis. Now, in addition to these 4 or 5, traditional miasms, there are different coping mechanisms or new miasms that he's also elicited, such as, if somebody is dealing with an illness by feeling, like a victim, persecuted or harassed by it, it's the Sankaran's malarial miasm. If they feel they have been shunned or people are isolating them or they feel they have to be, they're like an outcast, they're in a recluse, like a hermit, that's Sankaran's leprous miasms. So you see, these are the different types of coping mechanisms that you see, which is a part of the Sankaran's miasmatic understanding. Now, the mistake most practitioners make while using these miasmatic tools is they are using this, say for example, Sankaran strategy for a startup, a Sankaran's miasmatic analysis for a startup strategy at stage 1 and 2. And that's a problem. Or they are using a Hahnemannian Miasmatic tool for, a stage 3 classical approach. And again, that's the problem. You have to use the right miasmatic strategy for the right patient with the right strategy at their stage. You cannot cross. If you do, you are going to, end up in a spiral. So how do you do that? How do you use these remedies in practice when you're implementing a specific strategy? So let's come back to the startup strategy. Generally, in the startup strategy, you are using 2 separate groups of remedies. One is the startup remedies and the 2 is the Hahnemannian miasmatic remedies. So say for example, the startup remedies could be an organ remedy or a therapeutic remedy that you prescribe. But in addition to that, you also prescribe the Hahnemannian's anti-miasmatic remedy based on the not been well since syndrome, right? So this is something I teach all my beginner Argentum students. This is your kickstart strategy. It works fantastically well to get you off to a dramatic, change in your patients and get your foot in the door right from the first consult. Now, if you're using this classical or the breakthrough strategy, remember in about 70% of the cases, the classical or the breakthrough remedies cover the miasm. So say for example, your constitutional remedy or your keynote remedy or your sensation remedy will cover the miasm. So mostly only one remedy is needed because it incorporates everything. But in about 30-40% of cases, your indicated classical constitutional remedy may not cover the miasm, and you will need a separate anti-miasmatic remedy based on the Kentian or the Sankaran's miasmatic approach. Make sense? So now the question is, how do you pick the miasmatic remedies? So let's come back to the Hahnemannian miasmatic remedies. How do you pick the Hahnemannian miasmatic remedy? Now, Hahnemann has just denoted 3 key remedies for each of the miasm. Sulfur for sora, thuya for psychosis, and merksol for syphilis. However, you can also use the nosodes, which is made from the infective agent, as anti-miasmatic remedies. So you can use sorinum for sora, medurinum for psychosis, and syphilinum for syphilitic miasm, right? Now, again, as I've mentioned before, there are more than these 3 infections now seen in contemporary practices. My Argentum students have used streptococcinum for not being well since streptococcal infections. They've used, Epstein-Barr virus, nosode for not being well since glandular fever with incredible results. However, you need to know the syndrome well. You need to match it with the nosode at stage 1 to make that best miasmatic prescription. It's not throwing things in darkness, looking at there is a passage of streptococcal infection, so you give streptococcinum. It's not the case. You have to see that the syndrome of streptococcinum is also present in the patient. And then, along with that anti-miasmatic remedy, you have to give the startup remedies. Remember, there are two things that go together. That's why we call it the two-prong effect, because together they will create a synergistic dramatic unfolding to remove the block. Both these remedies are prescribed at different times. They're not mixed. They are prescribed in different potencies, so they're working on two different planes. They do not clash, but together they boost the patient and propel them and remove the block, right? So this is about the Hahnemannian miasmatic remedies and block. How do you pick the Kentian and the Sankaran's miasmatic remedies? Now the key here is that you need to select the constitutional or the sensation or the keynote holistic remedy that covers the miasmatic indications of your patient, that covers dominant miasm of your patient. So at this point, you would ask me, how do you know what miasm belongs to what remedy, or what miasm the prescribed constitutional remedy covers? So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're prescribing the remedy, the most common remedy, Calcarea carbonica, as a constitutional. So what's the miasm of Calcarea carbonica? Now, most polycrest remedies, remember, have all three miasms or multiple miasms. So I generally study remedies or understand them by a bar graph that shows you the coverage of these three key miasms. So for calcarb, we have this bar graph. We have all three miasms, we have the psora, we have the psychosis, and we have the syphilis, but the most dominant miasm in calcarb is psora, followed by psychosis, and then syphilis. This is the picture you need to visualize. So if my patient has a predominant psoric miasm based on the Kentian understanding, and the constitutional coming up is calcarb, it will work like a charm. But if my patient has a predominant psychotic miasm and the constitutional is coming up as calcarb, it will not work as well, right? Because it doesn't match the miasmatic graph. So I will have to use another remedy that has indications of calcium, but a psychotic dominant. Say something like Calcarea silicata, right? Or say if my patient has a predominant syphilitic miasm and I'm using calcarb as a constitutional, it will not work very well. I need to use another remedy with calcarb-like tendencies and indications, but a syphilitic pattern, something say like Calcarea floricum. So this is what you need to understand and study along with the mitra medica of the remedy. Now the question is, Shilpa, where do you get this graph? How do you know this? Well, these graphs are from my experience and practice. I've made hundreds of calcarb prescriptions from babies to elderly people, from rural cities to larger places all across the board. So that is the way you get through experience. However, if you're a beginner and just learning, the Fartak's Mitra Medica is the best place to learn the miasmatic indications of remedies using the Kentian approach. And you can derive the graph of these remedies. What I'm going to do is create a free video on how to derive the miasmatic indications of your favorite remedies, and I'm going to put a link below so you can find it as well. But we are also working currently on creating a reliable miasmatic classification of remedies in the HomeoQuest database. So check that out, coming very soon. You'll be able to understand the miasm of a remedy just by clicking on the remedy and finding it in the software, right? Let me give you another example. This is the miasmatic coverage of the remedy Arsenicum album. As you can see, it has all three miasms, but it has the least psychosis, a good psora, but a very dominant syphilis. So if arsenic comes up in a patient with predominant, say, tubercular miasm, I might not use this remedy. Instead, I could use an arsenic salt like Arsenicum iodum, which has a much more tubercular manifestation. All right. So hope this is making sense. This is what you have to know about remedies really well, the miasmatic patterns. So the bottom line is you cannot stick with one type of miasmatic strategy, one type of materia medica understanding, one type of approach. And if you would like to know more on this, please check my ebook on miasmatic blueprint and overview, where I share how you can use these miasmatic tools in practice through a real patient case study that has been followed for more than 1 year. So you remember, anti-miasmatics have changed the trajectory of my practice and my students' practices, and I'm sure it will yours as well. It's your sacred duty to use them well. Ensure that you can create that dramatic results for you and your patients. I highly, highly recommend getting my book on miasms. And thanks for watching this. Hope this was helpful.